He signed a check for $47 million, and the world barely noticed. Decades later, that single signature would decide whether he lived like a king or died buried under $500 million of debt. This is the story of a man who could buy almost anything on earth, and still could not buy the one thing he needed most. People remember Michael Jackson as the king of pop. Fewer remember him as one of the boldest investors of his generation, a man who understood the value of a song catalog before most musicians even knew what publishing rights were, and almost no one remembers, until it made headlines after his death, that the same man who owned a piece of the Beatles once came within days of losing his own home to foreclosure. How does a global icon, earning tens of millions every single year, end up nearly $500 million in the red? To answer that, we have to go back to a decision most artists never even consider making. The purchase nobody saw coming. By the mid-1980s, Michael Jackson was no longer simply famous. Thriller had turned him into a cultural force unlike anything the music industry had seen. Every radio station played him, every record store sold out of him. And while the rest of the world was still dancing, Michael was quietly studying something far less glamorous than fame: ownership. The story goes that Paul McCartney, a friend and occasional collaborator, once explained to Michael how real wealth in the music business came not from performing songs, but from owning them. Publishing rights, McCartney told him, could generate income for decades after a song was written. It was meant as friendly advice. Michael listened closely, perhaps too closely. Not long after, Michael learned that ATV Music Publishing, the company holding rights to a huge portion of the Beatles catalog, was quietly up for sale. The asking price was around $47.5 million, an enormous sum for any solo artist at the time. Instead of hesitating, Michael moved. Reports say McCartney was stunned. What had started as casual advice between friends had turned into one of the most lucrative business decisions in music history. A decade later, Michael merged his catalog with Sony's publishing arm, creating Sony ATV Music Publishing, and walked away with a payment worth close to $100 million while retaining half ownership of the new company. By the time that stake was eventually sold, years after his death, it was valued at $750 million. A single decision made in the shadow of Thriller had quietly become one of the most valuable assets in entertainment history. But financial genius and personal peace do not always travel together. The same instinct that led Michael to secure decades of future income would soon collide with another instinct entirely, one built not from strategy, but from longing. A kingdom built from longing. After the exhausting bad tour ended in the late 80s, Michael Jackson wanted one thing more than anything else: a place that belonged only to him. He found it in the hills of Santa Barbara County, a sprawling piece of land he would rename Neverland, after the storybook island where children never had to grow up. What followed was not simply the purchase of a large property. It was the construction of an entire private world. A working amusement park rose from the land, complete with a Ferris wheel, carnival rides, and a miniature train that circled the estate. A movie theater with a real marquee was built so Michael could screen films for guests whenever he wished. Exotic animals arrived by the dozens, from giraffes to elephants, alongside a beloved chimpanzee who became almost as famous as Michael himself. None of this came cheap. Keeping Neverland running, its staff, its animals, its rides, its constant upkeep, reportedly cost millions of dollars every single year. At its peak, more than 100 people worked on the property just to keep the fantasy alive. And yet, for Michael, the cost was never really the point. Neverland was not built as an investment. It was built as a substitute for something he had never truly experienced himself: a childhood spent playing rather than performing. He opened its gates to sick and underprivileged children, letting them ride the rides and roam the grounds for a few hours of pure joy. Staff members later said his face changed in those moments, that something in him finally looked at ease. But a private kingdom this size does not sustain itself on nostalgia. Every ride needed maintenance. Every animal needed care. Every guard, gardener, and groundskeeper needed a paycheck. Neverland was less a home and more a living organism that demanded to be fed, and Michael kept feeding it year after year without ever pausing to ask how long the money could keep flowing in that direction. When spending became a language. As the 90s rolled into the 2000s, something in Michael's relationship with money began to shift. It stopped being about ownership and started resembling something closer to compulsion. Associates would later describe moments that sounded almost unbelievable. Michael walking into an antique store and, within minutes, agreeing to purchase millions of dollars worth of furniture and sculpture, much of which would later sit untouched in storage. There were stories of entire mail-order catalogs being purchased, page by page. No selection process, no hesitation, simply an instruction to buy everything inside. Private jets were kept on standby. Entire floors of luxury hotels were reserved and left empty for weeks, holding nothing but Michael's belongings, because leaving them behind, even temporarily, felt unbearable to him. Financial experts who later examined his accounts found a pattern that had quietly become dangerous. By the middle of the 2000s, Michael was reportedly spending $20 to $30 million more each year than he was earning. To cover the gap, he began borrowing heavily against the one asset that still held real value, his stake in the Sony ATV catalog. Loans were taken out to pay off older loans. Interest accumulated quietly in the background while the spending continued in plain sight. It would be easy to call this simple recklessness, and many people did. But those close to him often described something sadder underneath the surface, a man trying to fill an emotional gap using the only tool he had ever been taught to rely on completely: money. Each purchase offered a brief moment of comfort before the emptiness crept back in, and the only response he knew was to buy something else. The kingdom falls and then rises. Again. By 2008, the pressure that had been building quietly for years finally became impossible to ignore. Neverland Ranch, the fantasy world Michael had built from nothing, came dangerously close to foreclosure. Notices were filed. For a moment it seemed the Ferris wheel, the private train, and the sprawling grounds might be seized entirely. A last-minute financial arrangement prevented the worst outcome, but Michael never truly returned to live there. He relocated to a rented estate in Los Angeles, paying 6 figures a month for a home that, unlike Neverland, was never his to keep. When Michael Jackson died in June of 2009, the full scale of his financial situation became public in a way few had expected. Estimates placed his debt anywhere between $400 and $500 million. Cash reserves were nearly non-existent. On paper, he remained enormously wealthy. His catalog, his image, and his music were worth staggering sums. In reality, very little of that wealth existed in a form he could actually access. And yet, the same years that produced this crushing debt also produced something rarely discussed with the same intensity: an extraordinary record of generosity. Michael Jackson is widely regarded as one of the most charitable entertainers of his era, reportedly giving away hundreds of millions of dollars over his lifetime to hospitals, disaster relief efforts, and causes supporting children around the world. The same hand that signed extravagant purchase orders also signed checks that quietly changed lives far from any camera or headline. After his death, something unexpected happened. The empire he left behind did not collapse under the weight of its debts. Instead, guided by new management, the estate began an aggressive and remarkably successful effort to pay down obligations and rebuild value. Touring productions, licensing deals, and the enduring power of his music transformed the estate into one of the highest-earning entertainment properties on the planet year after year, long after his passing. The kingdom Michael Jackson built did not disappear. It simply changed hands, moving from the man who created it to an entire system built to preserve it. The question, no balance sheet can answer. Michael Jackson was never a trillionaire in any literal sense. No bank statement ever confirmed a number that large. But he lived something that felt like it, a life so vast, so extravagant, and so far beyond ordinary limits that the word almost fits anyway. He bought the songs that shaped a generation before his own. He built a private world designed to recreate a childhood he never had. He spent with a freedom most people can only imagine, and somehow the emptiness remained. The real story of Michael Jackson's fortune is not simply about how much he earned or how much he owed when he died. It is about what happens when a person tries to purchase the one thing that was never for sale in the first place: a sense of safety, a sense of being enough. Think about the strange symmetry of it all. In 1985, a young superstar sat quietly in a room and made the smartest financial decision of his life, securing a piece of musical history that would still be paying dividends decades later. Barely 20 years after that, an older, more exhausted version of that same man stood on the edge of losing everything, propped up by loans borrowed against the very asset that had once made him untouchable. Genius and self-destruction, it turns out, can share the same signature. There is a temptation when telling a story like this to reduce it to a simple lesson about overspending. Do not buy the antiques. Do not keep the empty hotel floors. Do not build a private amusement park you can barely afford to maintain. But that framing misses something more human hiding underneath the numbers. Every dollar Michael Jackson spent chasing comfort was also a dollar spent trying to answer a question that started long before he ever had money at all. A question about whether the world would love him without a stage, without a spotlight, without a performance to hide behind. His music still plays everywhere. His estate still earns fortunes he will never see, fortunes large enough to make the very debts that once threatened to erase everything he built look small by comparison. But the deeper question, the one no accountant, no auction house, and no royalty check could ever fully answer, is whether all of that gold, all of those rides turning in an empty park at night, ever came close to filling the space it was meant to fill. Perhaps that is the real inheritance he left behind, not just a catalog of songs or a rebuilt fortune, but a reminder that even the largest kingdom in the world cannot protect a person from the quiet cost of being human.